Today we're going to take a look at break-even charts. So before you start drawing a break-even chart, top tips, make sure you've got some graph paper because you want your chart to be accurate. So graph paper makes that so much easier. And then before you actually start to put pencil to paper, make sure that you've worked out your maximum revenue points and your total cost point so that you can know how large you need to make the vertical scale before you start writing any numbers on there. So we're going to take a look at how you actually construct a break-even chart. And to start with, you're going to start with your axes. So your vertical axis is the monetary axis, and this is where you'll plot your revenues and your costs. And your horizontal axis is where you'll plot the level of output. So once we've got our axes, the next thing we need to do is then to start to draw in our costs and our revenues. And by convention, we start with our fixed cost line, which is a horizontal line because fixed cost will stay the same whatever the level of output. And then once we've done that, we're going to go on to draw in our variable cost line. And this one meets the vertical axis where the fixed cost line starts. So this is plotting variable costs starting at fixed costs, which will then actually give us our total cost line because you're effectively adding those variable costs onto your fixed cost. Then after that, in with our revenue line, and this one you can see the revenue line is going to start at 0.00 because if you're not selling any goods, then you're not going to be getting any money coming in for those goods. And that is the basic shape of our chart. So you need to be able to recognise each of those lines on a chart and label them if necessary. So moving on from here, we then use this chart to find out what the break-even output is. And you already know that break-even output is where the firm is not making a profit and it's not making it a loss. It's where total revenue equals total costs. So you can see where those two lines intersect, and then you can take a line vertically down to that horizontal axis and you can read off, if I had numbers on my chart, you'd be able to read off that break-even output is 50 units, whatever. There are also another couple of things to point out about this chart. So if you look at the area shaded in green, that is the area at which the company is producing profitably. So anything to the right of that break-even output, as you're looking at the chart, the company is going to be making a profit. And anything to the left, which is the area shaded in red here, where you can see our total cost line is actually higher than the revenue line. So anything to the left of that break-even output is where the business would be making a loss if they produced in that region. So moving on, another thing you can do with break-even charts is to compare your break-even output with your actual output. So here we've got our basic chart again. I'm drawn in the break-even output that you saw before. And now we're going to assume that the firm is producing slightly to the right of the break-even output. Now this tells us a couple of things putting this line in. The first thing you need to know is about the difference between break-even output and actual output, and this is known as the margin of safety. So again, that's a formula that you need to know, actual output minus break-even output, but you also might need to indicate it on the chart. So you state that as an actual number of units. The other thing this chart tells us, which again you sometimes need to indicate, is if the firm is producing at that actual output indicated by the green line, what profit is it making? So you can see the profit quite easily on the chart because you know the profit is going to be total revenue minus total costs. So you can see that in this example, that is point A, so where the green line intersects the revenue line, that's your total revenue, which you could read off. and then you're going to take away the total costs, which is point B. So you can see if you want to indicate on the chart where the business, the profit that the business is making at that output, it's that little green line between A and B. So far we have looked at a break-even chart, and it's great because the business, it can forecast its revenue, it can forecast its costs, and it can work out how much it needs to produce in order to start to make a profit. But the other thing you can do with these break-even charts is to do a bit of scenario planning, so you can sort of think around options. So here we're just going to look at using this exactly the same chart as we've been looking at, but to now ask that question: what will happen to our break-even point if our fixed costs increase? So here's our familiar chart with our break-even point indicated. So now what we're going to look at is drawing in a new fixed cost line, which is higher than the original, so fixed costs have increased. This will then have a knock-on effect on the total costs, because the variable costs will start from when that new line meets the vertical axis, so our total costs will be higher. And then you can see from that the intersection point between that cost to line and the revenue line has moved to the right. So this means that if the fixed costs have increased, the firm needs to produce more units of output in order to break even. And then we'll just have another look at a different scenario. So now we're going to assume that selling price is increasing, and to see what that does to the break-even point. So again, we'll come in with our basic chart that we've been using all the way through, and then we'll have a look at what happens when we draw in a new revenue line. So selling prices increase, so for each unit they're going to be getting a little bit more revenue coming in. So you will see that the line for total revenue gets steeper, and what happens to the break-even point is, again, you can see that the break-even point has moved, and this time it's moved to the left of the original point. And what this is telling us is that actually if the firm manages to increase its price and increase its total revenue, then they will break even producing fewer units than with the original pricing strategy. So you can see here that the break-even technique can be used to look at slightly different scenarios and to work out what the firm might need to do. So this technique is a useful technique. However, as with everything, there are some drawbacks. So to start with, we'll go back to our original chart. And then our first drawback is that costs are simplified using this strategy, and they're simplified to a straight line. And you can see that, with our fixed cost, we're assuming that it is a flat line. So we're not assuming that there's some steps at any point, that if a firm increases its output to such a level that it might need to have a jump in its fixed costs as it opens a new building or a new production line or something like that. We're just assuming that they're fixed. So we're not having any sort of step function in there. And the other simplification with costs is, again, that our variable costs are added onto the fixed costs, again, as a straight line, whereas in reality, you might see some economies of scale with variable costs, or diseconomies, but economies of scale, for example, you might expect to see your actual total cost lines sort of get less steep the more output that businesses are producing, because maybe they're getting some discounts for bulk buying their raw materials or something like that. But actually this model doesn't work with these complications, so that's a limitation. The next limitation is that all units are assumed to be sold at the same price. So you can see again, our total revenue line is a straight line. So for each unit, you're going to get the same amount of money coming in. And again, the reality is that businesses don't necessarily do that. So if you're thinking like businesses like brands like Doritos and Pringles, for example, quite often they're full price in the shops, but a lot of the time they're discounted. And Doritos, a pound a packet, or Pringles nowadays half price at 1.25 in order to increase the volume of sales. But that obviously gives you an example of where actually this sort of technique might fall down, because the business is not selling all its units at the same price. But for the purposes of this technique, we have to make that assumption that that is what is happening. And then on to our final drawback. And as with a lot of the things we've been talking about, like cash flow forecasting, we're looking at the future here. And so all the data that is used to draw these charts are estimates, they're forecasts. So you might have any of the inaccuracies associated with forecasts that we've already talked about. So those are the key drawbacks. Thank you for listening.